can I just do this to get
Yes.
Okay, and it is just my absolute pleasure to be presenting on this, and to also have the time. I've got a good amount of time to talk about this project that's been consuming me now for about 3 years. So I'm just going to get straight into it. Now that didn't work. Okay.
Can you ask the people if they're seeing, do you need to see your notes or do you just want the picture up?
They will just see the slideshow and Christina. They won't see this.
Okay.
Amazing. Okay. So because I've got about 35 minutes, I'm going to really talk a little bit about what's been going on with my research recently, but this is a general outline that I'm going to cover. So you get to know a little bit about me and why I'm doing this project.
And you probably do page up and page down.
Maybe.
Just click on that. That will go to the next.
Right, page up and page down.
Okay.
On the right.
No, the up and down not working. So it's just clicking
So
next. I think it takes a second.
Okay. Okay, so who am I? I forgot to put on the slide that I'm actually an AUT lecturer in communication studies, and I've been there for about 25 years. But actually media studies is not my big passion. I tell my work that. But actually everyone knows at work that I'm a sociologist first and foremost. I did my PhD up through the University of Auckland, through the School of Sociology and also Critical Education Studies. And as Jane said, my doctorate was around talking to young men about how they made sense of being boyfriends and this thing called romantic love. And that really fueled me for about 10, 15 years. I did my doctorate and had 2 children while I was doing it, so it took me 9 years to do it. And then after that, I actually helped Aisha for probably about the first year or 2 with her big financial violence project. And I must admit, I found it really, really hard. And Aisha and I published an article in Women's Studies about the challenges that we had with the fieldwork and my experiences of vicarious trauma through that project led me to actually step aside from that project, which has been quite a grieving process actually, because it's such an amazing project, and so glad that Aisha is doing all that work. After that experience, I decided I was going to take a break from researching humans in terms of having humans in front of me. So that was when I really leaned into my feminist media work. And I've done a lot of analyses of love stories in popular culture, looking at gender representations, and then of course over the last 3 years I've been doing this historical project, which I'm going to be talking about today. So where did this project come from? In 2023 I published an article for Violence Against Women, which was basically a glorified literature review about how the language of what I call male partner violence has changed and morphed over time. And through that, I really just looked at scholarship from across the Western world about that, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. But I wanted to know actually how language has been mapped and how the problem of male partner violence has been mapped in New Zealand, because a lot of the scholarship comes from either the UK or Canada or the United States. So that's why I decided to do this project, which is really looking just at New Zealand. So this talk today is actually part of a really big project. I'm what I call myself a lone wolf researcher. Aisha probably knows that too. I tend to research alone. And so this is actually a big project that the aim is I've started at 1845, and I will come up to present day looking at how print media in New Zealand has talked about and addressed male partner violence historically. But because that's quite a large project, I have chunked it up. So for the last 2 years, I've been looking really at, or year and a half, looking at 1845 through to 1895. And I've been in the newspaper archives. So the reason why I've chosen media archives is because it suits my place of work, being in comm studies. And also I have developed myself as a feminist media scholar. But also some beautiful human somewhere has digitised every single newspaper that has ever come into print in New Zealand. And it's from a place called Papers Past, which, oh, sorry, it's just not working.
Even it's taking a second to load, that's the problem.
Oh, okay. Sorry, everyone, we're just having a wee tech moment.
It's just taking a little while to load. Shouldn't be the case. I might just stop sharing and try a different method of sharing.
Hitting on that angle thing doesn't work with your mouse.
Oh yeah, it does. Okay, maybe I'll make sure. There's actually 2 different screens.
Could I have that here?
Yeah, sure, and then you'll have to navigate off of the big screen.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, just look
Okay, guys, we're going to.
That's okay. No, you'll still be.
I know, but yeah, okay. Right, so what you're now seeing is actually the homepage of Papers Past. So you can basically access newspapers right from when we first started having newspapers published. And so I started at 1840.
Yeah, do you want to go next? Just tell me when.
Maybe I'll do that because I
Yeah,
need to
sure.
go back and forth. Okay, sorry guys. I knew from my literature review that this time period, words that were used to describe male partner violence were wife beating, assault, cruelty, and ill treatment. So I knew that those were the keywords I was going to put into Papers Past. And I was surprised at how many newspaper articles there actually were in this time period. So I decided to take a year from each decade, the mid-year, so 1845, 55, 65, 75, 85, and 95. And this is what the numbers looked like. So really, really interesting. And this also maps actually what scholarship says about how around the 1880s, 1890s was when we actually had in the Western world quite a time of legitimacy around addressing male partner violence or wife beating in society. I'll talk about that shortly. So these numbers don't surprise me. And what I have as a hunch is that after probably about 1910, 1920s, we're going to see a complete die down of any articles at all about it. Now, just a second. Another mouse is working.
No. I'm trying to go. Yeah, it is.
Thank you.
Okay, which slide would you like? 8?
Okay, no, okay, so what I did, I don't use any machine learning or AI at all in any of my field work. So I do all manual spreadsheets. So this is what my spreadsheet looks like. And it was cataloguing each year and reading every single newspaper article that had been written about it. And I knew roughly what I wanted to kind of ascertain, particularly around language. And so I did that for every decade of the 1800s, from 1840 onwards. And it was a really interesting look at my work practices. So I got completely lost in this work. I've never been so lost, and lost in a good way, in the archives. And I remember that I just had this great compulsion to get through the data. And once I got to 1895 and I finished it, I then thought to myself, I don't think I've got enough. And then I counted, because I hadn't even counted how many articles I'd actually collated. And I found that I actually had 900 articles. And that was quite extraordinary for me to see what had actually happened in my work practice. But also I'm a qualitative researcher, so 900 articles is not something that I ever wanted. So I have gone through, I mean, the data is so beautiful and abundant. So now I've been scraping the data quite a bit, and so what I did was, and this is one of the peculiarities of this time, is that people were blatantly named in all of these articles. So I went through and I actually made little kind of folders of when different people had been mentioned or their cases had been mentioned quite a few times. And I also took out all the non-New Zealand people that were mentioned, so lots of international stories, and also anything that was just around desertion, which I'll talk about shortly as well. So yeah, and I started to get a more manageable corpus, if you like. When I was looking more in depth at newspaper articles where the people involved there'd been multiple articles about them, I did a little more in-depth look at what was talked about. So yeah, really scraping through and trying to create a qualitative sample out of all the stuff. This is just a very brief little literature review. I'm not going to go into this at all, but this is the article I was talking about, where I mapped the language of male partner violence through existing scholarship. And what I love about this work is that it's about charting the terrain of language. That also tells us not only how it was talked about, but it also helps us to make sense of it today. What I found, which is surprising, I think, but then not, is that the way that male partner violence has been talked about has come in waves. Up until the early 1800s, it was pretty much in the Western world, a husband had a right to beat his wife. There was some changes to that. So in the 1600s, the act of killing one's wife started to be seen as not acceptable. But a husband could beat his wife if she deserved punishment. So that was socially acceptable. We had the rule of thumb in the 1700s, so a husband was allowed to beat his wife with any implement as long as it wasn't thicker than his thumb. And so we kind of got, but we started to get a few little kind of cracks where certain countries and communities started to see it not as acceptable. And that's when we hit the 1800s, which is what I'm so fascinated by. Actually, I've got another slide, sorry. Sorry, everyone. Here we go. Yeah, sorry, I kind of went over this quite quickly. So just, yeah, in the 1400s, so there was a Catholic doctrine, which was the rules of marriage, which actually highlighted that the right to beat one's wife was godly. And so here we go through mid-1600s, there was an outlawing, rule of thumb, and then we hit the 1800s. In the 1800s, particularly around the UK and the US, there were two viewpoints. There was still quite a dominant narrative that wives deserved the violence that they got for various reasons. But there then was this growing paternalism. And I'm not a fan of men's paternalism. I think it can actually create this gender binary of women as being vulnerable. But the paternalism that was in the 1800s did actually underscore some progressive legislation, and it also, you'll see shortly, actually cast husbands that beat their wives as unmanly and cowardly. So there was some interesting work there. So my project. So what follows is a little bit of preliminary unpacking of how wife beating was addressed in the 1800s in this country. While my data set is largely media archives, media can only tell us so much, so there's also a lot of historical documentation, legislation, which I love delving into. Just so fascinating. Okay, so I'm just going to take a drink. So, what was the government's role? I've been teaching a politics paper at the moment, and we're talking a lot about the three estates of government. So our government was formed our colonial government was formed in 1852. And so the legislative was obviously forming their own laws at this time, so we weren't using the UK's laws anymore, and we had the forming of courts in this country. And so from the 1860s we got the Supreme Court, and then we also got the resident magistrates courts as well. And from my research, there were 4 pieces of legislation that actually came about that addressed wife beating in this country. The first one was the Offences Against Person Act. It's a really comprehensive piece of legislation around what offences were deemed criminal. We had our first divorce legislation in 1867, which was actually highly misogynistic. I'll talk about that shortly, but anyway, it did give women an option to divorce or separate from their husbands, although it was pretty much also for people that had money to do that. Then luckily the Divorce Act got remedied a little bit in 1898. And then we also had this Women's Property Act, which a little shout out to Asia as well around financial violence. There was this piece of legislation around protecting women's earnings and their property if they were deserted from their husbands or if they had a violent husband that had to leave as well. So that's quite interesting legislation. I'll just move forward a little bit. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about the legislation for a second as well. So the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act was our first divorce law. So men at this time just had to prove adultery to get a divorce. Women had to prove adultery and another crime. So it was pretty misogynistic. Now, the Divorce Act that came out in 1898 was better. So it meant that it didn't matter if it was the husband or the wife; they just had to prove some form of fault. And I just want to share this because there are some delightful things in the archives. One of our first governmental departments in New Zealand was the lunatic asylum department, a whole department around lunatic asylums, and you could actually try to prove that your husband was a lunatic to actually divorce him. So that was actually written into law. So I thought that was quite whimsical. Oh, that's right. Okay, so in 1898, the Divorce Act was a little bit better, and then it was rewritten in 1903, I think, as well. Okay, so let's look at criminal cases. The major cases of wife beating went through the Supreme Court. This is a little snapshot of the 1880s. What I'm flabbergasted about is the minimal jail terms. Overseas cases, there were lots of executions for men who were charged with murdering their wives. But here in 1880, it didn't seem to be that way. But here were the 4 top kind of murder cases of that year. And you can see that they're pretty confronting, especially the first one, where he murdered his wife just after childbirth. So, and he only got 3 years. So, yeah, that was quite shocking to me, and I still haven't quite worked out why that is. But the other, sorry everyone, the other cases, what I'm calling the lesser assault charges, when in actual fact there's no lesser assault charge, they're all pretty horrific, went through the resident magistrates court. There was also a mention of a police court, but I still haven't quite figured out in court documents what the police court actually was. It might have just been a colloquial term that journalists use. So these are the types of punishments that men got. And what is fascinating, which I'll talk about shortly, is the way that journalists talked about wife beating at this time. A lot of it was highly discursive, highly descriptive. So we can see here that he violently assaulted his wife, and we can see how he's done that. So there has been a whole range of things. He's threatened to kill her, frequent ill treatment. So he got this punishment, which was very common at the time. He got a surety to keep the peace. He would, if he couldn't find money, be imprisoned for 1 month, and he was bound over to also pay £26. I put down the bottom here what that actually equates to in today's kind of money. So these were quite decent fines in a way, but it was more around fining than actually imprisoning. However, with Gallagher in 1875, he just got imprisonment. So I presume that there was also a lot of discretion by the courts. So I haven't actually worked out why that is yet. Sometimes you kind of go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Okay, here's another one from 1885. So again, you know, see that discursive description. Mrs. Smith was covered with blood and there was a gaping wound on her elbow. He'd thrown a tumbler at her. She had to be stitched up by Dr. Wright. And we see here again that there was a keeping of the peace for 6 months and fines and sureties as well, which was very, very common of this time. And then the 1890s, again, this idea of keeping the peace and fines as well, which was how they kind of dealt with it. There was also many kind of straight dismissals. So I'll talk about provocation if I have time at the end. But if we look at Thomas down the bottom, the judge said that the woman was now out of danger, therefore it was just dismissed, which is disappointing. And also there was a few where the judge at the top handed it back over to the parties involved to sort out the matter. So there was inconsistencies around this type of thing. Okay, so then wife beating was also dealt with through divorce and separation proceedings. But again, this was for people that had money. So this is very class-based. And I've already talked about the differences here. Divorce, there was more hoops for women to kind of jump through. Judicial separations were also dealt with through the courts, and they were easier to get, but both were expensive in the grand scheme of things. Here's the Divorce Act of 1867 that I talked about, and here is how it was amended in 1898. I haven't been able to find this amended legislation online yet, but you can see that there was more equality in terms of women not having to do more to prove fault. And as we know, it wasn't until 1980 that divorce became a non-fault thing. So you no longer need to prove fault. And this is another piece of legislation that helped a lot of women as well. So when they talk about protection orders in the 1800s, it's not protection from violence, it's protection of one's earnings or their estate. And I'm really fascinated in this piece of legislation that came out. These types of orders were dealt with through magistrates' court, whereas divorce and judicial separation was dealt with solely in the Supreme Court. Many articles about this. Here's a little snapshot from the 1880s. So this was very newsworthy, this idea of women and these property protection orders. And courts readily actually granted it in favour of women, although some did not. There's still a lot of misogyny that we'll talk about shortly as well. The language also is quite peculiar of this time, this idea of praying for a protection order. And this was written into the legislation as well. Oh, thank you. Also at this time, in terms of legislation, a huge amount of temperance and alcohol awareness. so many of the stories talked about violence alongside drunkenness. So women could also seek a prohibition order to help their husbands get sober, which we know now is not really how one gets sober. But there was the Licensing Act of 1881, and then we had these societies, mainly Christian, particularly out of the temperance movement. So Good Templars, Benevolent Society, and the Hope of Christ Church Lodge. And these were talked about a lot. So people were named as being drunkards. And a lot of the violent stories mentioned this as well. A little thing around first wave feminism. I was surprised that actually the first wave feminists, although we call it a first wave once we're out of it, but they weren't feminists, or like the WCTU or the suffrage movement. They weren't mentioned a lot in terms of wife beating, but this is not surprising. So conservative feminists and the temperance movement also, they were more around Christian values, and particularly around child protection. There was a group of liberal feminists that really addressed violence against women during this time. So maybe that was why there wasn't so much mentioned, but we do know that regardless, the women's movement of this time was behind a lot of the temperance laws, legislation, Women's Property Act, all that type of thing. So let's talk about the newsworthiness of this all. Wife beating at this time was incredibly newsworthy, and there were lots of articles, lots and lots and lots, and there was different types of journalistic styles. So the first style is this very kind of short and sweet. Almost always the person is named, which is phenomenal, thinking of today's suppression orders, and very to the point. If we look at the Christchurch one there, James Crowley was arrested tonight on a charge of threatening to shoot his wife. A revolver and 50 cartridges were found on Crawley when arrested. And these were everywhere, these little short articles. And obviously newspapers looked very different at this time. And often these little articles were sandwiched. So sometimes they were sandwiched within a general theme. So there was like courts and crime sections. The one on my left is how a lot of these little articles were kind of placed right at the bottom. But sometimes they were put within kind of themes of different news that were not related to crime at all. So we see it here, the New York Police Court story, and then right under it was around a London theatre. So just these really bitsy little articles that didn't really seem well placed. Let's give me a second. There were a lot of mid-length articles, and this is where we start to get a more kind of descriptive or discursive account of the violence. And we also had some very long articles as well. So this was the execution of Dr. Pritchard. This was an international case where a doctor poisoned his wife. And it is a harrowing and detailed read, which fascinates me in terms of media studies and scholarship. So, like I've said, if we did get kind of a mid or long length article, it was incredibly descriptive. So you can just have a little read here of Wilson. He also used to make her stand without her clothes for hours together whilst he was lying upon the floor intoxicated. He beat her with a stick and took liberties with two women before her face. This kind of this ways of language, but this was front and centre in the media, and there were so many of these descriptive articles. It seemed to be the journalistic flair of the time. So that, and here's just some more as well. And you can see that, like, if we look at the one at the bottom, this was quite a prominent one that got quite a few articles. We just see how detailed and almost, it's in a kind of a dramatic genre that it's written. which I'm really looking forward to seeing how that actually starts to chart through the 1900s as well. So yeah, and can I make these slides available to people as well? Maybe they can have them. Yeah. I'm going through them quite quickly. So then kind of what is the language that was used? I really did a tally up of the specific language. This was how physical violence was named. So beating, assault, there was grievous bodily harm was brought into legislation around this time. Murder, obviously, a violent quarrel, thrashing. So there was these words that were available to be used. I predict that when I get into the 1930s and 40s, this language will all become euphemised, or if it is at all covered, into this idea of discord. But that will be what I find out next. Really pleasing to see that it wasn't just physical violence, so lots of verbal, psychological violence was actually being named at this time, which was encouraging for me to see that actually there was this language that could be used to name women's experiences of this. Lots of ambiguity though. Cruelty and ill treatment. They were used, but there was often not meaning behind what that actually was. Was really excited to see violence to property mentioned once in 1885, because as we know, this wasn't actually written into legislation for quite a while. But we still had euphemisms, this idea of conjugal felicity and infelicity, which was everywhere. It was the kind of the word of the time. Discord, quarrels, so there was some euphemisms used. A few additional notes about the language. As we know, marital rape was not considered a crime of any sort until very recently. So there wasn't any news stories I could find about rape within marriage. There was rape stories though, but it was outside of any kind of romantic setting. It's a stranger kind of situation. And if your husband had raped another person, this was grounds for divorce, but rape within marriage was not discussed. And there was a lot around desertion. So a lot of articles around husbands leaving their families. And so for Asia, this is a little early recognition of financial violence as well, and the protection orders of women's earnings as a result of this. And this is where I really get excited about is the gendered language that was used. So what we know, so this does not surprise me, the brute and the coward was featured quite a lot within newspaper stories. Here is just some little examples. I quite like the third one down, a mealy-mouthed and idle man. Coward, so heavily paternalistic. You are worse than a coward. A thing that would strike a woman could not be called a man. Now that is where this is quite extraordinary in terms of the pejorative way that men were talked about at this time, but it will not last. So this will not, and I predict will not be part of how newspaper articles talk about men later on to the 1900s. But yeah, cowardly and the brute. Lots of paternalism as well, which can actually hinder women's agency, but there was paternalism and infantilization, which is also disappointing to see. So a poor creature like his wife, a helpless wife, he was bound to protect her. But within this paternalism is also these judgments against men for being disgraceful. So these are difficult kind of discursive things to kind of work through, which I will do. And I kind of delve into it more. But then, really upsettingly, is this idea of the pariah. So there were lots of articles about wives that, that gave way to drink, or, she was a besotted wretch or a cantankerous woman. So there was, even though there was this discourse around the brutal, the coward, women did get talked about in very pejorative ways as well. And yeah, so this idea of her sad moral depravity, and talking about her sexual practices in the media, naming her as well. Marrying in haste and repenting at leisure, a thorough-paced harlot. And some of the judges were very happy to really shine a light on their views of women as pariahs. And of course, we have provocation. It was I just did 1880s for this one, but this idea of provocation, lots of husbands were talking about why they were driven, quote unquote, to violence. Sometimes the judges threw out cases because they felt there were faults on both sides, and obviously this is still something that happens today, so it'll be interesting to kind of map that. And we're actually in good time. Just a little note about gendered violence. So there were few articles about the wife as the quote unquote perpetrator, but we're looking at really small percentages here. So even from this little snapshot, we know that this is a gendered phenomena. So all of the kind of, I think about Murray Strauss and the conflict tactic scale, arguing that this problem is equally gendered. Just this alone tells us that historically it has always been very much men as the perpetrators. Interesting little kind of 4% here in the 1875, so yeah. But apart from that, very minimal amount. So in conclusion, we have time for questions. What I find quite moving with being in the archives is looking at the courage of women at this time. Obviously, many women didn't even make it into the newspapers because they weren't actually getting divorces, or because they were not didn't have enough means to get any help. So, so there's a lot of courage and a lot of what isn't actually being talked about in this data set. Also, for women navigating violent marriages within a climate where this idea of coercive control, narcissistic abuse, marital rape was not even discursively discovered yet. So there was a huge amount of courage. Next steps, I need to start writing some of this up. But the next steps is to look at the rest of the 1900s. And from my research, I know that we are going to find it very different. So what I find really fascinating, though, is that, because I use the term male partner violence because it names the doer of the violence and it doesn't frame the victim in any way. If we look at the 1800s and the 1970s, we see this way of gendering the problem, and even though it puts the person experiencing it within the label and ignores the doer of it, it is a lot more gendered and specific than this idea of marital discord or even domestic violence, which tends to ungender it. So, so very, very interesting. Got through all the slides. We've got time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was fabulous. I can't imagine that experience of looking through all of those archives. Just absolutely amazing. So everybody join me in a big paki for Christina for that incredible work that you've done. And I think we'll stop the recording now, Q&A. And yeah, so if people